Welcome to today's powerful message, where we delve into the profound ways that God's goodness not only guides and protects us, but also transforms our lives in ways we may never expect. We often find ourselves facing difficulties, trials, and even doubts, but it's in these very moments that God's goodness shines brightest. Today we will explore how God's goodness is at work behind the scenes, providing us with strength in our trials, and revealing His protective hand in the everyday moments of life. With inspiring biblical examples, you'll discover how God guides us through the storm and transforms our hearts, making us vessels of His peace and love. In the hustle and bustle of life, it's easy to overlook the quiet ways God is present. But once we begin to open our eyes, we realize that His goodness is woven into every aspect of our lives. Whether it's during a storm or in moments of peace, His presence guides us, protects us, and leads us into the fullness of who we are meant to be. Today's message is one of reflection, inspiration, and a call to look deeper into the blessings we often overlook. If you're ready to explore how God's goodness is evident in every moment, make sure to like this video, share it with others who need to hear this truth, and subscribe for more content like this. We invite you to join our community of believers who are striving to walk in God's goodness every day. Your thoughts matter to us, so feel free to comment below. Let us know how God's goodness has been evident in your life. In the depths of despair, when it seems like all hope is lost, there's a profound truth that believers often miss. It's the truth that God's goodness is not merely something we experience in moments of joy and prosperity, but something that profoundly sustains us through the darkest trials. Consider the story of Job. Here was a man who, by all appearances, had everything: a thriving family, wealth, status, and health. Then, in a series of devastating losses, Job lost it all. His children died, his wealth was stripped away, and his health deteriorated to the point where his body was covered in sores. Yet in the midst of this unimaginable suffering, Job's response was not to curse God or turn away from Him. Instead, Job clung to his faith, even in the most perplexing circumstances. His words, "Though He slay me, yet will I trust in Him," are not the words of a man who has everything, but rather the words of someone marked by the deep, unshakable understanding of God's goodness. Now, in our own lives, we may not face the same extreme suffering as Job, but we all go through trials. Some of us struggle with health problems, some with financial instability, and some with broken relationships. We are prone to ask, "Why me? Why is this happening?" But the mistake we make is thinking that God's goodness is only evident when things are going right. In reality, it is often in the midst of our deepest pain that God's goodness shines the brightest. God's goodness doesn't always deliver us out of the trial immediately. Instead, it provides us with the strength to endure it. This truth is critical for our daily lives. How often do we find ourselves overwhelmed by life's difficulties, believing that we are being punished or forgotten by God? It's easy to look at the circumstances and assume that God has abandoned us. But what if the very trial we are facing is the place where God's goodness is trying to show us something deeper? If we look at Job's life, we realize that God's goodness did not leave him when things got hard. It was precisely during his suffering that God provided Job with the strength to continue. Job didn't understand the reasons behind his suffering, but he knew that God was still good, and that knowledge anchored him through the storm. This is where we make our mistake. When we face difficulties, we often mistake them for signs of divine punishment or neglect. We may even think that God has forgotten us or doesn't care about our struggles. But God's goodness, as revealed in the Bible, is not dependent on our circumstances. God's goodness is not a fleeting emotion or a surface-level feeling that disappears when life gets hard. It is a deep, abiding presence that sustains us, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. Imagine walking through a storm without an umbrella or a jacket. The rain is pouring down, the wind is howling, and the cold is biting. You're soaked to the bone, and the world seems harsh and unforgiving. But then in the distance you see a light. It's not the end of the storm, but it's something that provides warmth and direction. It's not a quick fix, but it's enough to guide you through the darkness. This is how God's goodness works in our trials. It's not always the immediate relief we want, but it is the strength and endurance we need to keep going. God's goodness doesn't always stop the storm, but it gives us the fortitude to walk through it with faith and courage. We often mistake God's goodness for something that should only come in the form of blessings and easy circumstances. But real strength, real growth happens when we lean into God's goodness during the hardest parts of life. The strength to endure, to persevere, and to remain faithful, even when everything else seems to be crumbling, is a direct result of God's goodness in our lives. So, how do we learn from this? How do we avoid the mistake of only recognizing God's goodness when things are easy? The first step is to surrender to the trial and trust that God is with us in the midst of it. Instead of focusing on the pain and asking why, we should focus on God's presence and trust that He will give us the strength to endure. The second step is to open our eyes to see how God is providing for us even in the most difficult times. It may not be in the way we expect, but His goodness is always present, sustaining us, giving us the strength to face another day. God's goodness is not just a concept we acknowledge during good times. It is the foundation that holds us up when life tries to knock us down. It is not the absence of suffering, but the power to endure it. God's goodness provides strength in the trials, and through those trials, He shapes us into stronger, more faithful people. Imagine walking through life feeling constantly burdened, carrying the weight of your mistakes, doubts, and fears. You wake up every day feeling overwhelmed by the challenges ahead, as if you're walking through a storm that will never end. This is a reality many of us live in, isn't it? But there's a hidden truth we often miss. God's goodness is not just something we talk about. It is a transformative force that has the power to change every part of our lives. And yet we fail to recognize its power because we're too focused on the immediate, the visible, and the temporary. Consider the story of the Apostle Paul, a man who at one point was Saul, a persecutor of Christians, a man who thrived on hatred and violence. He had a reputation for being merciless, driven by the belief that he was doing God's work. But one day on the road to Damascus, everything changed. God's goodness manifested in a blinding light, and a voice from heaven confronted Paul and completely transformed his life. This wasn't a mere change in behavior, it was a complete reorientation of his heart, mind, and soul. The man who once persecuted Christians became one of the most powerful advocates for Christ's message, spreading the gospel with a zeal that defied human logic. What happened to Paul? What was this force that took him from a murderer to a messenger of grace? It was God's goodness. This goodness is not just an abstract idea, it is a transformative power that can take the worst of us, the broken, the lost, and turn us into something new. It's a goodness that doesn't just change us on the outside, but on the inside. It reshapes our hearts, renews our minds, and shifts our entire perspective. But how does this happen? And why do we often resist it? The mistake many of us make is thinking that God's goodness is only for the good people, the ones who have it all together. We think we need to clean ourselves up before we can experience it. But here's the shocking truth. God's goodness is not dependent on us being perfect. In fact, the more we recognize our brokenness, the more we open ourselves up to receive this transformative grace. It's like a person who walks through life with their hands full, clutching onto their past mistakes, regrets, and fears. They're so consumed by these burdens that they can't open their hands to receive anything new. And even if the greatest gift were placed right in front of them, they wouldn't be able to take hold of it, because they're already holding on to something else. Many of us live like this, unaware that God's goodness is right there ready to transform us, but we're so fixated on our flaws that we miss the opportunity to be changed. But here's the key. To experience God's goodness in a way that transforms your life, you must let go of the old. You must release your grip on the past and the mistakes you've made. This is the lesson the Apostle Paul learned. He was no longer identified by his past actions, he was identified by God's calling and grace. He no longer saw himself as Saul, the persecutor, but as Paul, the servant of Christ. This is a powerful shift that many of us overlook. We let our past define us instead of letting God's goodness redefine us. In our daily lives, we make the mistake of believing that we can only change by our own effort. We try to fix our problems on our own, only to become more frustrated when we fail. But God's goodness doesn't require us to fix ourselves first. It's the very thing that gives us the power to change. When we recognize God's grace and surrender to it, we unlock the potential for transformation in our lives. This means that even in our lowest moments, God's goodness is still at work, shaping us into who He wants us to be. Consider the story of the prodigal son. This young man made mistake after mistake, leaving his father and squandering his inheritance on reckless living. Yet when he finally decided to return, broken and repentant, his father greeted him with open arms. He didn't scold him, didn't list his wrongs, he welcomed him with love and grace. The prodigal son didn't deserve this kindness, but that's the nature of God's goodness. It's not about what we deserve. It's about what He chooses to give us. And in that moment of acceptance, the son was transformed. In our own lives, we often feel like we need to earn God's favor, like we need to do something to deserve His goodness. But this couldn't be further from the truth. God's goodness is a gift freely given. It's available to all who are willing to receive it, no matter their past or their mistakes. And when we receive it, something amazing happens. We are transformed. We become people who can forgive, who can love unconditionally, and who can live with purpose, because we've experienced the transformative power of God's goodness. The key mistake we make is thinking we can earn God's love, or that we are too far gone to be transformed. But God's goodness is not about our ability to fix ourselves. It's about His power to transform us from the inside out. When we surrender to His goodness, we experience the kind of change that nothing else in this world can offer. We go from being broken and lost to being healed and whole. And this transformation isn't a one-time event, it's an ongoing process. As God's goodness continues to shape us into His image day by day. If you want your life to be transformed, stop trying to fix it on your own. Recognize that God's goodness is not a distant concept but a present reality, ready to change you in ways you never imagined. Trust in it, surrender to it, and let it shape your life. When you do, you'll discover that God's goodness is not just something you hear about, it's something that will make you new. Imagine for a moment that you're walking through a dense fog. You can't see your hand in front of your face, and every step you take feels uncertain. You hear noises around you, but you don't know whether they're harmless or dangerous. You feel alone, afraid, and unsure of which direction to take. This is how many of us live our lives daily, lost in the chaos, unable to see the path clearly, feeling directionless. But here's the shocking reality. God's goodness is like a light in that fog. It's not just a distant promise, it's meant to guide and protect you in the midst of life's uncertainty. Let's consider a biblical example. The Israelites found themselves in a very similar situation when they were wandering in the wilderness. They were lost physically and spiritually. They had just been freed from slavery in Egypt, yet the journey ahead seemed endless. They faced hunger, thirst, and fear of what lay ahead. But God didn't abandon them in the wilderness. In fact, He provided a tangible, visible sign of His presence. He led them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. In the midst of their uncertainty, God's guidance was there, visible and undeniable. No matter how hard their journey became, no matter how long the road seemed, the Israelites knew that God was with them, guiding them and protecting them. This is exactly what God's goodness does in our own lives. It leads us, even when we can't see the way ahead. Life is filled with uncertainty, with unexpected twists and turns that leave us feeling lost. But just as the Israelites were led by that cloud and pillar of fire, God's goodness guides us through our own wilderness. The mistake we often make, however, is assuming that we must walk through life on our own. We believe that we have to rely on our own strength and wisdom to make decisions, navigate challenges, and protect ourselves from harm. But that's where we go wrong. When we're caught up in the chaos of life, it's easy to forget that God's guidance is available to us every step of the way. Instead of relying on our own limited perspective, we need to surrender to the leading of God's goodness. The mistake is thinking that we're supposed to have it all figured out ourselves. In reality, we were never meant to walk alone. The key to overcoming life's challenges is trusting in God's ability to guide us. But how do we recognize His guidance in the noise of our daily lives? It starts with really listening for God's voice. The world is loud, full of distractions and demands. We hear the opinions of others, the pressures of success, and the constant stream of information from social media. But God's voice doesn't compete in the noise. It's often a still, quiet whisper. Just like when God spoke to Elijah on Mount Horeb, not in the earthquake, the fire or the wind, but in the gentle whisper. We must learn to listen for His voice in the quiet moments of our lives. The mistake we make is assuming that God will shout at us or send us dramatic signs, when in reality, He often speaks in the small, subtle ways. We need to tune out the noise and listen closely for His direction. There's another mistake we often make in our search for God's guidance. We wait for the perfect answer before we take any action. We think that God will give us a clear, unmistakable direction before we make any decisions. But sometimes the first step of faith is just to move forward, even when we don't have all the answers. Trusting in God's goodness means knowing that He will guide us, even if the path is unclear at first. Just as the Israelites didn't always know where they were going, but trusted the cloud and the fire, we can trust that God's guidance will lead us step by step, even when we can't see the end result. It's about trusting that the next step will be revealed when we take the first one. Furthermore, God's goodness doesn't just guide us, it protects us. The Israelites weren't just following a cloud, they were also being protected by it. That cloud shielded them from the harsh desert sun. The fire provided warmth and light during the cold desert nights. God's protection is not always something we see in dramatic moments, but it's always doorways. We often fail to recognize how God's protection is keeping us safe from harm, shielding us from dangers we can't even perceive. Think of all the times you've avoided an accident or disaster, not by your own doing, but by God's invisible protection. We may not always see it, but His goodness is guarding us, leading us to safety when we don't even know we're in danger. The mistake we often make is thinking we are the ones who must protect ourselves from harm. We try to control every aspect of our lives, believing that it's up to us to avoid trouble. But in reality, God's protection is much greater than anything we can do on our own. When we place our trust in God, we invite His guidance and protection into our lives. It's not about avoiding all problems, but knowing that no matter what happens, we are never alone. God's goodness surrounds us, guiding us, protecting us, and leading us on the path He has prepared for us. We must learn to surrender control and trust that God's goodness will always be there, even when we can't see it. Instead of relying on our own strength and wisdom, we must trust in His ability to guide us through the storm, protect us in the wilderness, and lead us to the promises He has for us. And when we do, we'll discover that God's goodness isn't just a distant idea, it's a present reality that transforms our lives in ways we could never imagine. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insights into God's guidance and goodness. Leave a comment below and share how you've experienced God's protection and direction in your life.